Welcome to the Latin American Perspectives podcast. My name is Alexander Scott. I am a member of the Latin American Perspectives editorial collective, and I'm usually the host of this show. But today we're departing a bit from our usual programming. It's been about time we provided our listeners with some content, so today we'll be sharing an excerpt from one of our internal political education sessions at the Journal, featuring remarks by Sandra Levinson, which I think folks will find timely and thought-provoking. Sandra Levinson is the executive director and co-founder of the nonprofit Center for Cuban Studies and the founder and curator of the Cuban Art Space Gallery in Brooklyn, New York. In her talk, Sandra offered us her reflections on her experiences in Cuba and the contemporary state of Cuban art, culture, and politics, drawing on decades of experience engaging with artists, intellectuals, and activists on the island. We hope you enjoy this special presentation.
Cuba's very complicated right now, as I'm sure you all know. And one of the problems in talking about Cuban culture is that if we were talking about the cultural landscape, say 5 years ago, it would be very different from what we're talking about right now. I mean, Cuba is in such a difficult situation that, we're facing a situation where many artists are leaving, and which is actually creating a real crisis in the cultural arena. And the best known artists remain in Cuba, because they have a career in Cuba, and they also travel a lot. They go back and forth a lot. Many young artists, on the other hand, are leaving to come here or Spain or Mexico or Italy, wherever they might get a beca. And they're leaving because of the economic crisis. They're not leaving because of repression. I mean, there may be 5 or 6 activists who have sat in, gotten arrested, demonstrated, gotten arrested, and they have certainly said they're leaving because of repression. But I have yet to see any real repression of the artists. Maybe that's because I don't know that many artists under the age of 20. But I'm talking about people who are still working every day or every week as much as they can, whether they're working in music and theater, in the visual arts, in dance. Cuba has somehow, I really don't know how, in this very difficult economic situation, but somehow Cuban cultural life has managed to stay alive. You can go into any Cuban city today, whether it doesn't have to be just Havana. You can go into Trinidad, to Cienfuegos, to Camagüey, certainly to Santiago, and even many small towns in between. And there are good local dance groups, good local orchestras, good local individual musicians. There are clubs. One of my favorite clubs is actually a Beatles club in Cienfuegos, where these terrific Cuban musicians sing nothing but Beatles songs and do a very good job, and to great applause. But the people who are in this country who didn't leave for any kind of economic reason, but many of them, for example, Ana Mendieta left as a child because her parents took her out of Cuba at the beginning of the revolution. Elsa Mora, another great contemporary artist, left because she fell in love with a hotshot Hollywood producer. And she, and she left with William. So there are, many people leave because they've married someone who is Spanish or American or Italian or whatever. But the artists who have left and have made it are distinguished very often by their ties to Cuba and by the socio-political culture. I mean, I think the revolution has really defined the best artists. And so even those who no longer like the revolution, have problems, had problems, it's always been interesting to me that the ones who actually have had the most conflict with the Cuban government have never really left Cuba. I mean, they leave, they come back, they get arrested, they leave again, they come back, they try to get arrested. They make a stink, like Tanya Bruguera. And I only recently found out that someone told me, well, you have to realize that Tanya Bruguera, who is in many ways an excellent artist and very popular, but someone said, but don't forget, Tanya Bruguera's father was a general and very close to Fidel, and she never really had to worry that she was going to be stuck in jail for more than a few days, no matter what she did. I said, okay, so that's very interesting. I mean, the kind of connections that people who grew up in the revolution have is very often, well, in a way, to me, it's interesting that so many of the artists in Cuba who do leave to go to the one country that has most oppressed them, namely this country. I think it's a kind of Stockholm syndrome.
Yeah.
I really do. But many of the most famous artists in every field, you know, um, are navigating their lives now between Cuba and whatever other country invites them, can support them. For example, one of the hottest young artists, Mabel Poblet, is right now doing her second residency at the Dale Jurassic um, compound in the Bay Area for a month. It's the second time she's been here. Um, she's also traveled to Portugal, traveled to Japan, been in Florida, wherever people know the artists and have galleries, have shows, have ways to bring them here for a time. But most of these people all go back to Cuba. And I think that a lot of it has to do with the fact that Cuba has a very strong cultural pull on artists of every kind. I mean, they were shaped by the revolution, they react to the revolution, and whether it's positive or negative, their art is formed by their years living in the revolution. And it's interesting to me that none of the artists leave before they've completed their free education in the graduate institutes of art. So I think they recognize how great is the teaching. And many of them have had, incredible experiences. I remember the very first artists that we invited to the United States were Chaco, um, and Nelson Dominguez. And both of them, when they graduated the art school, instead of having to sign up for military service, they were sent to Angola for 2 years to teach in the art school there. And their 2 years in Angola shaped their art tremendously. They came back. I mean, Chaco, of course, is black. And Nelson is white, but they both came back doing black art because what they found in Angola was that, first of all, their Afro Cuban roots connected with the Angolan students, but also the Angolan students and their culture connected with them. And I don't know if you remember, um, I remember a very interesting article in the New York Times and a fascinating quote from the great Henry Kissinger, who said that when he visited Angola, the only foreigners who connected with the Angolans and the only foreigners who went outside of the cities and went into the countryside and learned to speak their languages were the Cubans. Cuban doctors, Cuban soldiers, whatever Cubans were there, connected. And I think, that's a part of the Cubans' cultural heritage too. The people that most of you probably have heard of are still very much connected to Cuba, whether it's someone like Alberto Lescay in Santiago, the great sculpture artist and painter. Um, People like Mendive, Mendive has been doing his art and his connections to Santeria and the Afro-Cuban history. He has probably done more to teach people interested in art around the world about the fact, as Fidel often said, we are Afro-Latino. We are not just Latinos. Um, People like Jose Fuster, who started community projects. It's always been very interesting to me that in Cuba, one of the things that the revolution has done for so many of the artists is to teach them the art of community and how much more they can accomplish by working together. I mean, Fuster was from the countryside. He went to an art teacher's school. He started doing ceramics. And now he lives in a town outside of Havana called Jimenitas that is now called Fusterlandia by tourists because the whole town has become Fuster's ceramics, paintings. The very first house he ever decorated was the Medico de la Familia. And since the Medico de la Familia permitted Fuster to paint the side of his house, everyone thought, oh, well, I don't mind if he paints my roof. When anybody who needed a roof repair got a roof repair, if they also allowed Fuster to put up one of his ceramic roosters, let's say. So the whole town is now personalized by the people who live in their houses and by Fuster Ceramics. Other artists from all over the country and the world really have come to contribute tiles. And all of it is very political. He's got a whole corner that is the grandma with Fidel and Raul and various other heroes riding in the grandma. So he's done a lot to teach young people about the history of the revolution while at the same time teaching them art. But he's not alone. There's a collective of self-taught artists in the little town of Maya, about an hour outside of Santiago, that we met on our first art trip in 1995. And that was when they were just organizing. And Cuba has had kind of a prejudice against folk art because with the revolution, the government has been so proud of their art schools, which were formed after the revolution, and of their professional trained artists, that they really didn't want to promote the self-taught artists. But when the Soviet Union collapsed in the 1990s, and many of their academic artists chose that moment to leave, or they got married and left, that was when people who had never done any painting before suddenly said, well, maybe I can take up painting and get some money. And for example, in Cienfuegos, there was a geography teacher named Montebravo who had been drawing and painting since he was a kid. And he decided to basically start painting. And all of a sudden, he became famous in Cienfuegos. And when our art groups visited Cienfuegos, he became famous for us. And he became a source of learning. Even though he was white, he was interested in Afro-Cuban culture. And because he was gay, he was also interested in presenting the gay life in a very subtle way, but very definite in many of his drawings, prints, and paintings. And little by little, and Ron knows this, because most of what he acquired for his gift to the university was self-taught art. And the self-taught art, we like it very much because it is grounded in where people live. What people paint is what they see every day when they go to work, when they walk out in their streets, when they are in their fields, whatever else they are doing. This particular collective outside of Santiago, for example, one of my favorite artists there is a policeman. And he very often would come home still in his policeman's uniform, sit down outside of his home in front, put up his easel, and start painting the kinds of things that you would never imagine a local policeman would think to paint. Um, One of my favorites from another of those artists, one that I got very early on, he was a truck driver, and beautiful, beautiful, detailed painting. And I bought one of a young woman walking a path with a lot of trees and agriculture around. She's walking a path, reading a book with a little dog coming along behind her. And the painting is called Mi Mejor Amigo. And so I asked Roberto, I said, "So, who's your best friend?" And he said, "The book, of course." Most people, when I asked them, they said, "The dog." And said, well, um, but I think that, um, I tried to convince the people in Havana to start looking at self-taught art as valuable and something that they would include in annual shows or competitions. And they said, "Well, we're really more interested in academic art." I said, "They're doing some great things." And so finally, one year, about 10 years ago, I convinced them to go to Maya, and they allowed one person from Maya, Luis El Estudiante, he calls himself the student because he considers his father, who ran a bakery and started the group, the master, El Maestro. So he's El Estudiante, even though he's now in his 40s. But then he was younger. And he won second prize in the competition. So ever since, the academic people who run the annual competitions have included some folk art. So I feel it was something we accomplished. The other thing that we accomplished at the center was that we sued the Treasury Department in 1992 to allow the importation of original Cuban art. You probably already know this, but in case you don't, in the late 1980s, thanks to Howard Berman, Congress passed a law saying that all informational materials coming in to the country would be permitted. But when the Treasury Department finally got around about 2 years later to defining what they meant by informational materials from Cuba, it included the obvious, of course: newspapers, books, everything we'd already been bringing in, not thinking it was illegal. Um, Posters, photographs, prints, recordings, not original art. So I went to our lawyers, who are also the lawyers for the Cuban government, and said, "I think we should sue them, sue the Treasury Department. How can you possibly say that original art isn't information, but copies of the original art are?" "Well, they consider information something that can be distributed widely." I said, "Any piece of art can be distributed widely now. Guess what? We have the internet." He said, "You don't have a chance. They don't want Fidel to get the money." I said, "What about the artists?" He said, "Okay, I'll take it to court if you prepare the case." So I did. We didn't really have computers yet. I had to take slides of all the art, pictures of all the, with my knicker mat, pictures of all the prints of the art to show the difference, to show that the real information about a piece of art came from the original. Had two great big books. I interviewed 12 people who were critics and collectors of Cuban art about the differences, etc. And we went into court that day, and I saw the judge had my two big books, and he's looking at it very carefully. I felt very proud. And then he looked over at the Treasury Department lawyer and he said, "Do you really intend to carry this case forward?" And the Treasury Department lawyer said, "Of course, Your Honor. Why wouldn't I?" And the judge said, "Well, because I can tell you right now, if the case is before me, you don't have a chance." And I saw Michael Krinsky go, and I went, and the Treasury Department lawyer surrendered on the spot. And not only did we get the importation of original art, but the Treasury Department decided to issue licenses to collectors and gallerists for the purpose of going to Cuba only to buy Cuban art. And while we were asking was the right to import it, to exhibit it. We didn't even suggest that we might want to sell it and never send it back to Cuba. But the Treasury Department gave us full reign. We could bring it in for whatever reason. We could keep it forever. We didn't have to send it back. And that was that. And so most of the Cuban artists are very grateful to us. And I learned something very interesting. Even though fewer Americans travel there than Europeans, for example, I was in Cienfuegos one day talking to a couple of the artists. And I said, "Well, but you must be doing great. There are so many Italians here and so many Germans and so many blah, blah, blah." And they said, no, they don't buy like the Americans. I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "You Americans are the only ones who think you have to have paintings on your bedroom walls and on your dining room walls and even in your bathrooms. In Europe, people seem to think it's perfectly okay to go see paintings in museums and galleries, and they don't necessarily think they have to buy everything they like." So it was a very important lesson for me. I never knew that. I didn't think of that as something, but of course we are capitalists and we want what we want. So I know that we've had a big impact on many Cuban artists being able to survive, and they're very grateful to us for that reason. A lot of the people who have left, whether it's permanently or impermanently, of course, are in Florida. And Tomas Sanchez is in Costa Rica because he likes to do paintings of the environment. And most of the people who have left, and this is true of everybody, whether they're writers or painters or actors, have left for greater opportunities. I mean, that's especially true of a lot of the musicians. You become famous in Cuba and you become famous in the United States to the extent that the US government permits you to travel here to get a visa. But you can't book into a lot of clubs depending on whether or not you're going to get a visa. And right now, Cuba is going through a terrible time. I mean, there's terrible food insecurity, there's a lack of materials, and there are greater professional opportunities outside of Cuba. While there were a lot of tourists, there were constant shows, there were constant everything, but the pandemic really put many of these kinds of things out of business. And when you're out of business for 2 or 3 years, it might as well be a lifetime for some of these artists. and the greater professional opportunities, and the fact that a lot of people, especially in the United States, had just been waiting to pounce on these artists who were not able to come and were not willing to leave. Um, but almost no one who leaves thinking they've finished with Cuba. You know, um, they don't cut their ties to Cuba completely. And as I said before, I think Cuba has a very powerful cultural pull. And the revolution itself has played such an important part on not only the generation of the revolution, but the generation of all the artists who studied in all the wonderful schools that were set up, the music and dance schools. And there's an incredible dance school in Santiago. There are art schools everywhere. Um, and they're competitive for entering. Um, but they have an influence far beyond the relatively few students who actually go, because the Cuban artists are really not competitive with one another. They live in a very collective way. They share the people who come to visit. They share their opportunities. They share their materials. Um, and I think that, I mean, I'm not sure how far afield you want me to go in talking about Cuban culture. I hope, just ask me some questions. The thing is, I've been there too often. I stopped counting after 400 trips. Um, I feel very, very close to Cuba. I feel very frustrated that the center has not been able to end the blockade. Um, I took the job for 1 year because the person we hired quit 2 weeks before we opened. Some of you may know or remember Roberta Salper. She was teaching Latin American literature, and she'd been to Cuba, and she was the person we hired to be the executive director when we first started the center. And 2 weeks before 2 weeks before we would open, Roberta quit to go work with Claridad. Um, and she said, "I'm going to be a Puerto Rican socialist now." I said, "You're a Jewish intellectual. How are you managing that?" So she was at Claridad for about a year, and then she went back to the university. But there we were, stuck. So that's how I became executive director. And I meant to stay for only a year. But a Cuban exile blew up the center with a very big plastic bomb with me in it 10 months after we opened. And it angered me enough to decide to stay until the embargo was ended. So I'm still here. Have you got any questions?
Sandy, thank you so much. Um, the journal at one point had a problem with the U.S. government. There was
No kidding.
there was a rule that um, didn't permit American journals to publish Cuban material written by Cubans in Cuba.
What?
Yes, and we had
You
an
mean when we published History Will Absolve Me, we were illegal?
article by a Cuban anthropologist, I think, focused on religion in Cuba, and we accepted that. And Barbara Metzger, who was our copy editor or manuscript editor I mentioned earlier, she refused to edit this manuscript because the penalty was $500,000 fine.
What?
Yes. And we joined with the Latin American Studies Association, LASA, to file suit against that, and they dropped that whole thing. So it was probably the same time you were
Yeah,
engaging.
that's
So
really absurd.
it was absurd, and it was a real problem uh, at that time. But anyway, um, you you and I have been working on the popular art. I call it sometimes art naive. It's some of it is by painters or artists who are trained, and sometimes and mostly, I suppose, not trained from the ones you know. But you have
Right.
gathered together at the center so many so many paintings, so many artists from over these years, especially I think since that end of the Soviet period and influence in Cuba. Uh, and we have a project that kind of follows up a little bit on my interest, which started in Brazil, but have expanded elsewhere. I'm interested in popular art, as I call it, everywhere. And everywhere I go, I look for artists like you described. And I usually just reaching out to lend them a hand, try to help them, just let them know that someone's interested in what they're doing for no other purpose. But they always seem to have a story to tell. And the Cuban artists have a story to tell. And
Absolutely.
and and so what we're trying to do is pull together. We have a collection of about 110 works of art that we put together. We're going to do a book on it. And I
Well,
don't.
when I first went to Cuba, the only art I really knew about were the posters. And so that's what I started collecting. And now we have the largest collection of Cuban posters outside of Cuba, probably of anybody. We have several thousand. We've got 10,000 works of art on site in our little gallery. 10,000.
Well, yes, I had 550 posters about which I gave to the university. I don't want people to forget it here either.
Yeah. I mean, it's very important. And I think that, um, yeah, what we've been talking about is the fact that these self taught artists, are very connected to Cuba. And I have to say, I mean, although we collect art of all kinds, but personally, I'm most connected to the artist, to the art that still says Cuba. I mean, there are some artists who have become so internationally known, including some of my very best friends, that they started doing the kind of art that would be more interesting and more acceptable to metropolitan areas around the world, right? And also, it's the kind of art that we can't bring in. I mean, we can't bring in um, huge hanging things that spin around and come in 20 different pieces that we have to put together. They're the kind of installation art that has become so popular in the last 10, 15 years is something that we basically cannot bring in. Just the way we cannot bring in large sculptures. We can bring in small sculptures, we can bring in ceramics, but mostly we bring in paintings and drawings, works on paper, and small sculptures, as I said, ceramics, um, and posters. The several thousand posters we have, but the art is, they do every kind of art there, and it's wonderful. It's just that our particular interest is in showing something about the country at the same time. We
Well,
want it to be identified as Cuban. When people look at it, they say, oh, yeah, I can see that has to do with Afro Cuban, it has to do with Santeria, or it has to do with the countryside, it has to do with the environment. They know that it's connected in some way to what's going on in Cuba currently, or in the recent past, or historically, you know.
well, we about a year ago we had some discussions about the possibility of doing an issue of Latin American perspectives on culture.
That
Uh,
was the Canadian things
oh,
that you sent me at
we
one point.
from the Canadians, and
Mhm.
we had an interest in that woman who's now in Australia who did two books on popular culture in Cuba. I've forgotten her name. She's a sociologist. You know her, I think. But we came to a general decision that we would do something on Cuba to show the world more about this uh, this art, this culture that you are so involved in, and but we don't have anybody to pull it together. And do you think it's still on our list as something we want to do. Do you think that it is still a worthy project for the journal?
I do personally. And I would try and find somebody for you that I think would be good at pulling it together.
Other people may have comments and questions. We can have a dialogue here forever.
Anyway, we have enough late night conversations.
You want to talk to Sandy, you call her at after 9 o'clock, 8 or 9 o'clock California time. That's when she's ready to talk. Have a conversation. It might go for an hour or 2 hours.
I'm one of those 3 a.m. to bed people. No questions?
Yeah, I have a question. It's not directly about art. I guess I'm curious, for those of us who felt some encouragement with the baby steps that the Obama administration took to sort of reversing the awful policies, and then it's been doubled down on, and Biden, of course, is a total loss. Do any of the Cuban artists who are in the United States or elsewhere, do they work together in any way to try to shape US policy or to try to get rid of some of these awful onerous restrictions?
None of the artists do. They're really too afraid. They figure their visas will be taken away, they won't get their green cards, they won't be invited back. I mean, the US government has all the power to allow them into the country or not. And I can't think of any artist who is active in any way. There are a number of Cuban exiles who are, but they are not artists here in any kind of temporary way. They are people. I can't think of any artists. There are some academics. There are a few, but I mean, people are just too afraid of what this government can do to them. I mean, that's why I say it's like the Stockholm syndrome.
Yeah.
I mean, they.
Yeah, well, it's like Lhasa. You have to hold it outside of the country because you can't get visas for Cuban scholars to come. I mean,
It's outrageous. It's outrageous. And the thing is that Obama didn't do a very good job with Biden. That's all I've got to say. And Obama also, in his autobiography of his years in the White House, he doesn't mention Cuba once. He doesn't mention what he did to open relations with Cuba.
oh my God.
Not a sentence. Nada.
It's graceful.
And, Trump, 247 executive orders against Cuba. Biden reversed one, I'm sure, from pressure from the U.S. airlines, because Trump said American commercial flights could only fly to Havana. You'd think he'd realize he's hurting the Cuban exiles because they're the ones who mostly go to Cuba, and their relatives don't all live in Havana. They wanted to fly to Holguin and Santiago and Cienfuegos and, all over. But so that was the only thing that Biden reversed. Now the flights can go anywhere that there's an airport to receive them. But that was it. That's the only thing Biden did. It's outrageous.
Yeah, pathetic.
It is pathetic. I mean, it's very, very, and Biden doesn't seem to understand that he's not going to win Florida anyway. Obama was a one-off. He won Florida, but Biden isn't going to win Florida unless he goes down there and says, gets some balls and says, look, I feel very bad for you. I know you're still crushed after 60 some years of not having your country be what it was before. But get over it. They're suffering. We've got to end this embargo. Let's have normal relations. You can go back and forth. The beaches will be open to you again. Blah, blah, blah. I mean, he acts like it's still a question of Cuba's a dictatorship, and that's why the exile. He doesn't seem to get it that it all has to do with money, 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 money. The people in Florida are crazed thinking that if we open up things with Cuba, people might prefer the beaches of Cuba to the beaches of Miami. And they should. I don't know if you remember several years ago, maybe 10, 12 years ago, the head of the largest church organization in Canada during one of the attacks on Cuba by this country issued a call to all the Canadians that all of you Canadians who go to Florida beaches all the time, go to Cuba instead of Florida. And immediately the Canadians started going to Cuba in massive numbers. To this day, the Canadians are the ones who visit Cuba the most. They have their own hotel. They don't go anywhere except to the beach. They have their own hotels, all-inclusive hotels. And if they go somewhere that doesn't have an all-inclusive hotel, they make it into an all-inclusive hotel with Canadian shows at night and things that appeal to the Canadians in English. I mean, they have good food in Veradero at their Canadian hotel, but they don't even go into Havana, you know. But I'm sure that that is the biggest motivation. And, you know, because the Cubans consider anyone who was born in Cuba to be a Cuban forever, that has allowed the Cubans in Florida to now go in and take advantage of the fact that the poor Cubans without any money and without any food are selling their homes and leaving to go somewhere else. So now the Florida Cubans are swooping into Havana and buying up all those places. Many of them are turning them into private hotels for any relatives they might still have. They're buying cars so that their relatives can drive taxis and they get the income. They have opened a huge Costco-like store where they sell items, Costco items, for more than you and I pay, which means who can afford it? Only those who have access to dollars. That means the diplomats and the Cubans who have family outside who send them regular dollar amounts. I mean, it's very corrupting and it's very sad. So that's the current situation that we're fighting. And we've got a president who is somehow afraid to deal with the Floridians directly. Very cowardly, really incredible.
Well, look at Gaza. I mean, no courage at all.
Oh, yes, of course. It's just another way of treating a country you don't agree with. Let's kill them.
Yeah.
Sandra, everything you say about Cuba, we can apply also to Venezuela. Venezuela is passing through the same situation, the same ordeals as a
That's
result
right.
of the sanctions.
That's right.
Affecting Venezuela equally. I wanted to ask you if you see, Cuba has faced an a particular economic crisis during the special period, and now again in the post-Obama years. And I was wondering whether you see a connection, a relationship between those periods of economic crisis and the criteria with regard to artistic expression that the Cuban government promotes.
You know, I can't see you.
Oh,
why can't I see you?
You can't see me. Why
No.
not?
Use the arrows.
I see myself on the screen.
I see myself too. But okay, now I see Tamar. Who was talking to me, Alex?
No, Steve Elmer. Do you see?
Oh, now I see you. Now I see you.
Okay.
I was so concerned about trying to see you that I missed your question. I'm sorry. I was pushing everything to try and see you. Will you please repeat your question?
Sure. The relationship, if you see any, between the periods of economic crisis, the special period in the 1990s and the post-Obama period, whether there's a relationship between that and the types of criteria with regard to artistic expression that the Cuban government promotes.
Well, first of all, I think the government realizes it cannot promote any artistic expression. I think, if you talk about promoting some artistic expression, I would say it's probably limited to the ballet, or but certainly not the visual arts. And in fact, many of the government organizations that existed in the 90s, for example, during the special period and before, I mean, starting like the government agencies that promoted all the political posters starting in the 60s and the 70s and continuing through the 90s. Many of those organizations, of course, don't exist any longer, even though they were government organizations, and they were basically propaganda organizations, right? And there's been so much turmoil in the cultural field in the earlier years, especially in the 80s and the 90s, with the first generation that graduated from the graduate art school. And there was an early attempt before an official Ministry of Culture existed by little autocrats who weren't really cultural people, who were running things under Armando Hart. Armando Hart was good, but the people who ran the music, the art school, etc., under him, were not Armando Hart. Let's put it that way. And so there was a lot of unrest around that and a lot of pushback. And I think that the pushback was basically successful. They said, you can't tell painters what to paint. You can't tell, I remember one of the few incidents where artists were actually arrested for a happening. There was a figure of Che that had been put in stone on a street, on a floor, right? And a number of artists came, and not with permanent paint, but with paint that could be washed off, right? Added to the figure of Che. And the cops came and said, "You are disfiguring our national hero. You cannot do that." And I mean, it was ridiculous. And they arrested them, and 2 days later they were let out of jail. But those kinds of little demonstrations were going on, but with such pushback that finally, it was really Fidel who realized that art was a great promoter of the Cuban Revolution, and it was great for the Cubans that the artists could do whatever they want, and basically said, hands off, right? And that's when the art world really flourished after that. There were good people in charge. The petty bureaucrats were basically thrown out. And I think that what's going on now is that there are so many problems that nobody is in charge, So individual artists are not having a problem in painting what they want to paint and presenting what they want to present. But on the other hand, they no longer have the kind of government support they had before because the money isn't there. And so I think on the one hand, the government feels it can't really order anybody to do anything because they're not paying for it much anymore. And also, Cuba is much more sensitive to international opinion than a lot of other countries. I know that it's just incredible to me that people here talk of Cuba as a terrorist state, as the kind of dictatorship. I don't know what they think it must be like. I don't know. What? Syria? They think they're Hamas. I don't know. They're certainly not Netanyahu. um, I think that I've never found anybody unwilling to criticize the Cuban government quite loudly and in my presence or anyone else's presence. I think the Cubans react mainly to anger. As long as whatever you are criticizing, you say in a decent voice and in a non-critical way, they're willing to discuss anything with you. That's been my feeling ever since I started going to Cuba. And it's one of the things I most appreciate about it. I think that it's very difficult after Obama opened relations. It was really wonderful for the Cubans. First of all, everybody from the United States started going to Cuba again, which was a tremendous help to the economy. And it wasn't dependent on Cuban exiles sending. Excuse me, I was in bed sick all last week with this horrible cold cough, so I sound pretty stuffed up, right? But I think that the whole cultural landscape is changing right now. If we're talking about culture, right? Not just social culture or political culture. But the cultural landscape, the Cubans have become so well known and so popular, whether they're the musicians, especially in the United States and Europe, theater throughout Latin America, the visual artists, especially in the United States, Canada, Italy, even Israel, that Cuba really belongs so much more to the world than a lot of other Caribbean and Latin countries, in part because of its love-hate relationship with the United States through all of its history. But also it's very complicated. They're very close to us in many ways. And they picked up some of our worst habits and some of our best habits. But they're super smart. I keep thinking they'll find a way out of it as long as they can just be given a little help, but without any help from this government, and just pushing against it and always throwing it in with Venezuela and Nicaragua. And Cuba is not Venezuela and Cuba is not Nicaragua. And I don't know what's the best way to get that through. But I think that if Latin American perspectives can do a really good issue on culture in the broadest sense, it could have a real impact if it's done right. But we have to put blame where blame really is. And I don't know. It's, everybody is walking a tightrope, not really knowing how best to talk to people in the United States because they're afraid of being interfered with in some way. We know that the United States government and the Cuban government are saying okay to some of these things. I mean, I was at a meeting of cultural workers at the Cuban mission not long ago. And one of the people who was there was Niederlander, who owns half the Broadway theaters, speaking very proudly of the fact that it's been acceptable to the Cuban government that he bring a Broadway show to Cuba. And I really felt like saying, well, what about bringing a Cuban show to Broadway? Another person stood up that night and said, We're bringing cable television to Cuba. Cable television that Cubans have to pay for? They get everything for free now? But they can't be doing these things without the agreement of the Cuban government. What the hell? I mean, they don't need Broadway shows and cable television in Cuba. They need something much more.
That's all the time that we have for today, but thanks so much for tuning in. To stay up to date on new issues, articles, and podcast episodes from Latin American Perspectives, be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And don't forget to subscribe and rate the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or your preferred listening app. If you're a student, academic, or activist interested in Latin America, or simply someone who wants to engage with the most in-depth and well-researched scholarship in Latin American politics, political economy, society, and culture, please consider subscribing to the journal. Our annual print subscriptions start at $74, and we offer discounted rates for students and members of the Latin American Studies Association. In a moment marked by the rise of right-wing authoritarianism, the erosion of independent publishing, and the broader decline of print and academic media, supporting journals like Latin American Perspectives is more important than ever. Your subscription helps sustain a critical space for internationalist, anti-capitalist, and decolonial scholarship. Keep an eye out for new episodes this fall. We have a lot coming down the pipe for you. Hasta la próxima. Gracias.